all the chairs. Do we have enough? Yes. Well, first of all, thank you to all of the speakers. These were all fascinating presentations. And I was very interested in seeing some common themes that everyone mentioned, as well as seeing differences between how each project, I doubt whether I should say each country, but reflects differences in the approaches. So in terms of themes of commonality, it was great to begin with your presentation, Håvard, because walking is, of course, an activity that everyone in the end is talking about. And I was very interested in this. We're not really discussing other forms of program like sports or, mega events, music, etc. It's just the simple activity of walking out in the landscape, which made me think about how powerful that is as a kind of cultural position. And then the second one is this issue of carrying capacity. I think all of the speakers, either directly or indirectly, talked about this as a question that they bring. How many people, if we agree that we're going to give access to all of these landscapes, then how much, to how many, and how are we going to do this? And this seemed like it was either directly or implicitly addressed in the conversations. And then finally, in my mind, because in the United States we have so little support financial support from the governments. What is the role of government in all of this? And here we saw in terms of funding, we saw perhaps the greatest diversity in the approaches. Jacob, in Denmark, you didn't address this, but one has to assume, or one wonders, this is a question, in this project, how much is private development funding the public infrastructure? In Sweden, Ingrid and Karen, I was so inspired to see that there's such a clear position that the green areas and access has to be publicly owned and as well publicly funded. In the project in Helsinki, I was fascinated by the creativity of these public-private partnerships between landowners and the idea of integrating them into the access to the islands. And then in Emma's, Sweden, yeah, Helsinki, Sweden, Emma. I am very interested about the pairing of the school and the public space, and how that idea is evolving. And of course, we all know about the challenges in Iceland. This is something that we all follow very closely from across the Atlantic, because we have some of the same problems in places like Yosemite, Yellowstone, the big national parks in the United States that received a lot of very heavy infrastructure early on. This is in the 1850s when they started, and yet today, 175 years later, we are still finding that they are inadequate because the world is so much more interconnected and it's so easy to get there. So these are all very interesting issues. And why don't I start with the first question about carrying capacity. Einar, you mentioned that for you, carrying capacity also had an element of the local. Is it carrying capacity for who? For the tourists or as well as for local people? How do you begin to resolve this conundrum?
The notion of carrying capacity has become an issue and talked about in Iceland with all the number of tourists. And many of the sites that are frequented by tourists, they are obviously overrun, so they are over carrying capacity. But then it's also a question of you can have the physical carrying capacity, and then you also have the social, your experience of the site. And we recognize, for example, at the site where I represent, where I work at, is that there's a very strong feelings and strong sentiments amongst Icelanders, is that the Icelanders, they feel almost alienated to some degree at the site, that there are so many tourists there.
Mm-hmm.
So they have a very lower feeling of threshold of feeling that their social carrying capacity has a way lower ceiling than
Threshold, yeah.
maybe busloads of tourists who are maybe accustomed to being in crowds. So I think the social aspect, the social carrying capacity is depending on the groups, but the carrying capacity in general, you can also accommodate, and we've been working on different ways to mediate the crowds and funnel them through the site. But there will always be sites that have a max and a lot of people. The government has now, just recently, I don't have the full verdict on that, but they have actually been working on a larger scale strategy for carrying capacity in Iceland in general. And they're going to take it from the whole country down to regions and then trying to figure out the sites. So, yeah.
Are they thinking of orchestrating, say, certain sites for mass tourism, certain sites for the locals, a calendar?
I think
I mean, what are the various ways that they're thinking
obviously,
about this?
as Howard was speaking earlier on, is that Iceland is not sold out. I'm not on a commission from Icelandair or anyone, but you can travel very freely in 3/4 of Iceland without seeing many tourists. It's basically the congested areas are in the south and the west, so it's in a way a congestion that is localized in the south and the just immediate west, maybe 150k out of Reykjavik. But this government scheme about trying to figure out the carrying capacity will result in some indicators to each site and to each regions, how many should be there, and also it will help to then be a catalyst for infrastructure input and money and funding. So we are kind of slow, we are catching up now to some degree to the. So I just say about tourism, just be careful what you wish for.
Yes.
Because, and plan ahead. I mean, that's, the wisdom and what you can learn from Iceland is that you have a baseline, something to do with today, and then you have to plan from there. How many tourists do you have today? How many tourists do you want? And how much infrastructure do you want? How much infrastructure can you fund and build to accommodate that increase?
And I imagine politically, or even to convey that message publicly must be a very sensitive issue.
Yeah, tourism, it's a heavy industry.
From
I mean, you are dealing with
not so much,
a lot of money, and you are just dealing with one of the biggest economical earner in Iceland today. So it is a bit of a struggle as well. Mm-hmm. So it's not never going to go smooth and easy. Yeah. But it takes time, and I think we are slowly getting there.
Joni, did I pronounce it right? Probably not. I did. What about how you're addressing this issue with the beautiful islands and coastline and these public-private partnerships? Do you get to calibrate access?
Yeah, I was asked about this before the presentation, and I felt a bit stupid answering that. We really haven't thought about the consequences of promoting the tourism so hard on these very delicate islands. And Einar has provided us with a good piece of advice of how to try to adapt and what to learn from Iceland. And he said that be careful of what you wish for, because you might have it. And at the moment we are in a stage of actively promoting tourism, and there's a strong political will to have a new major tourism attraction in this maritime context. But I hope that we're progressing slowly and incrementally, and we'll be able to adapt to the challenges. And the first biennial in Vallisaari will certainly be sort of an acid test for tourism in the archipelago, and after that we'll see what kind of problems we have or don't have, and what we do in the future.
But you were very clear when you said the city cannot act alone. And I was very interested in that position, because clearly you are in conversations with local stakeholders, landowners, etc. Who makes the investment in the cabins, in the forest, in the paths to get to it? I imagine in the boardwalks or in the piers, the boats, the access itself. How do you parse out who's paying for what? What is tax money from all of the, say, city versus what is direct investment from the landowners?
We're providing tax money for infrastructure in piers and so, but the boat traffic is operated commercially. And the question of who will invest in the service buildings and cafes and restaurants and hotels and so on, we don't really know yet. But during this autumn, we will see what kind of investors they will be, and what kind of sums, and what the scale of the development will be. It's really interesting.
Okay. Jacob, was there any discussion when you presented this vision about how this would be negotiated in city politics and with the people?
Yes. This is in essence a piece of activism. Nobody paid us or asked us to do this project. In fact, it was released a couple of days, maybe a week before the official plan for a large expansion of the city into the existing harbour was presented by the municipality, or rather by the development company working as the extension of the municipality. Their job is to create new city, to develop property, to sell
development
to private
rights.
developers, but it's actually a publicly owned company. So this kind of, I think, to some extent, blindsided them, and the reaction was maybe not as positive as it could have been. But we felt a need as an office, as landscape architects, or as planners from the point of view of the landscape, a need to comment on what's going on in Denmark, not only in Copenhagen, but in most larger cities in Denmark. A slow de facto privatization of the coastline or the access to the water is taking place, and this is then in Copenhagen. It's a public company doing it. So this just to us seemed wrong. As I said, it's a dream. It's probably not going to change anything for Rio, but it brought up a discussion that we think is very important. Discussion of not just how we're doing things, but why and how fast we are doing things. Do we take the time to think? Do we take the time to learn from former mistakes? Or are we just going along as fast as we possibly can? And the reception was positive in some ways. It snowballed the discussion, but I think the people in power felt kind of blindsided by this. So.
Excellent case of activism. Yes, to decouple development from access rights to. What was your opinion about the various ways that public access is inscribed into all of these constructed projects?
Well, coming from another world than the landscape architect world, from another planet, I was thinking, what's so Nordic about what we heard here? And I think it's up to the audience kind of to think about that. I made a couple of reflections myself. You are all in some way talking about nature, like untouched by man of some kind. From Denmark, we heard that you have no untouched areas. We don't have in Norway either. According to climate change, our glaciers are melting away, and we find traces of the human activities on the very highest mountains. But still, we love to be in that idea. From Finland, we heard that there was a high biodiversity. They were just some decades old, and the plants are probably growing on stinking soldier juices from the past. So what's so natural about that? We saw from Sweden, a little bit, not that much. You were very urban from the pictures. We heard from Stavanger that you built a huge and very expensive and very successful bridge around that ugly rock. And 40% of Norwegian space area is that kind of ugly rocks. So I don't just blast it away. But still, nature and the concept of the untouched is, I think it's not only Nordic, but it's very Nordic, I think. And the other thing, what I saw from the images from your projects was a little bit maybe linked, I want to link it at least to what my presentation is. It's clarity. We don't talk too much in the Nordic countries, so we want to know where to go and where to be. And I think it reflects also the clarity in IKEA or Marimekko or whatsoever. I think that's maybe a Nordic thing that we want clarity in things. I'm not quite sure that I saw it, but I wanted to see it.
Do we have a couple minutes for questions from the public? It's already 7, and I think that was our time. But if anyone is absolutely jumping out of their seats to say something to the speakers. Yes, exactly. Yes.
Also involve the public parties and private parties to develop also these kinds of solutions. And we're just in time.
Yes.
And maybe we should stop thinking about this like common ground somewhere. And as I said, it's not nature, it's some sort of art or something. And if you're going to visit some places with art, as the colorist was sick in Antwerp, you are allowed to be there for 1 minute and then you have to leave. So why we protect art so much more than what you define as nature?
Yes.
We could start putting a question on that.
That's another form of carrying capacity, right? To limit.
Is this really the resource that
Yes.
we should misuse?
Excellent question.
I got a little comment to Iceland again. I'm sorry. maybe it's annoying, but I've been to Thingvellir after reading Njål Saga. And mostly this was addressed as the carrying capacity of the soils and the vegetation. But being there, have you read Njål Saga? If you are too happy, read it. That will help. And it's a grand saga. But coming there after such Thingvellir is a holy place also. For, of course, Icelandic people, that's where your state kind of started. And it is close linked to literature. Maybe Njål is the most important one. And watching people coming from all over the world, taking a snapshot, we've been there. It's a sacred place. Don't you think so? Is that a part of it? Because when it comes to wearing out grasslands and starting erosion, your sheep are much worse, and your Icelandic four-wheel drive cars is much worse when it comes to volume of it.
Yeah, I can. Hello. I can respond to this. That you are absolutely right about the notion of Icelanders towards the site. For all Icelanders, this is it's a holy site. It's written in the law actually that it's a sacred site, and which makes it actually even more stronger statement. So it's not just something that you are tipping about. This is in the law. But we haven't been able to put up, for example, I've used it before, a passport control into Thingvellir, sort out, the foreigners from the Icelanders. That's not possible. So we have had, with this tsunami of tourists that's been just pouring into Iceland for the last 6 years, we've just been kind of fighting just to safe ground. So I think all the notion for the time being, like the last 4 or 5 years, we've just been trying to deal with the masses. But I have a very strong feeling that with the master planning process that we are starting now, that we will start to answer these questions. How are we going to steer the flow? And one very important part of our master planning process that is starting is to phase out all the car parks that is just below. We just want to take them away, and you have to do some electric bus down to the side from one direction and take all the car parks away. But one notion as well is good to keep in mind with Thingvellir is that we have a saying in Iceland, "Nú þröng á þingi." That means now there are a lot of people at the parliament. So in a way that echoes the old past when there are many people at the site. And this site is actually a little bit different from the rest of the Golden Circle with 1 point visit, good for snapshot, gaze it, take the hot spring thing. It is a big site, so people can actually meander through, and it holds more people. But this notion of Icelanders not visiting the site as much as they did in the past, there are all different reasons for that as well. My cousin who picked us up at the airport, the bus station here yesterday, she said in a way something that echoed a little bit the same. I never go down to this, what's the street called, Karl Johan, or some street here? No. I never go there, nothing but foreigners and tourists. So in a way, this is something that when you have sites that actually, become mass tourism sites, they start to push. And this is, I know, I've been in the States, I've been working with the National Park Service, and they have the same over there. There are many sites where the locals, Yosemite, Yellowstone, and all these sites, they have the same sense. But it's a much more of a challenge for us to regain this momentum with the Icelanders, and this is something that I feel that we haven't had time and effort to do in the last 5 years, but we will get back.
Well, thank you to our speakers, and thank you to everyone for being here.